The rain found Wellington Barracks before midnight and settled in like an uninvited guest with nowhere else to be. It came in waves, heavy and deliberate, drumming against the barracks roof with the kind of persistence that made sleep feel like a negotiation rather than a right. Most of the men in Corporal Thomas Hadley's section had stopped trying by 11. They lay on their cots in various states of restless wakefulness, staring at the ceiling, listening to water find every crack and gutter and downpipe in the old building and make its presence loudly, thoroughly known. Hadley was not staring at the ceiling. He was sitting upright at the edge of his cot, forearms on his knees, running tomorrow's orders through his head for what was probably the 14th time since lights out. Not because he'd forgotten them. He hadn't. Thomas Hadley had a memory that his drill instructor had once described, without any particular warmth, as disturbingly precise. He could recall the exact wording of a briefing delivered 6 weeks ago in a cold gymnasium with a faulty overhead light. He remembered the map coordinates of every position along the coronation route, the spacing requirements between men, the exact angle at which his bearskin had to sit, the precise moment at which eyes, right would be called, and exactly how long it would need to be held. He ran through it all again anyway, not from anxiety, from habit, from the particular discipline of a man who understood that the difference between a good soldier and a great one was not talent. It was the willingness to prepare past the point where preparation felt necessary. His kit was already done, had been done since 6 that evening, tunic pressed with the kind of obsessive attention that left creases sharp enough to draw blood. Boots brought to a mirror shine through 40 minutes of circular polishing with a damp cloth, and a patience that his bunkmate, Private Gerald Oakes, had watched with something between admiration and genuine concern. Bearskin brushed, crossbelt polished, white gloves folded and ready on top of his neatly squared kit bag. Everything in order, everything exactly where it needed to be. Outside, London was not sleeping either. Even at this hour, he could hear it through the rain, distant voices, the occasional burst of singing, the sound of hundreds of thousands of people who had traveled from every corner of the country and beyond, settling onto pavements and curbs and folding chairs, wrapping themselves in blankets and macintoshes and whatever else they'd brought, determined to hold their patch of ground until morning. They had been arriving for days. Some of them had been there since Saturday. They would sleep on wet stone for the privilege of standing 6 deep on a pavement for a few seconds of gold, and crimson passing at speed. Hadley thought about that for a moment. The distance between what those people were doing and what he would be doing tomorrow, and how entirely different the experience would be. They would see a spectacle. He would be part of the architecture that made the spectacle possible. They would carry photographs home and show their grandchildren. He would carry the memory of standing absolutely still for 7 hours in June rain, and the satisfaction of that would be entirely private and entirely sufficient. He lay back on his cot and closed his eyes. He didn't sleep for a long time, but when he did, it was clean and deep, and he woke without an alarm at 3:45, 4 minutes before the barracks lights came on, and he was already sitting up when Sergeant Ronald Briggs pushed through the door. Briggs moved through the barracks the way a man moves when he is trying to project control he doesn't entirely feel. Hadley saw it immediately. He'd been watching Ronald Briggs for 18 months, long enough to know the difference between the sergeant's natural authority, which was genuine and considerable, and the performance of it, which was what he was offering this morning. The tells were small. Briggs was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a voice that carried naturally and a way of occupying a room that made junior men instinctively stand straighter. But this morning his color was wrong. Not pale exactly, more like the particular gray of a man running on nothing but will and tea. His eyes were slightly overbright, the way eyes get when a fever is working somewhere behind them. He was enunciating every word with the deliberate precision of someone, concentrating very hard on sounding normal. Rise and dress, full ceremonial inspection in 40 minutes, move. The section moved. Hadley dressed with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had already mentally rehearsed every step of it the night before. Tunic, belt, gloves. Bearskin settled and adjusted until the spirit level of his own internal calibration said correct. Around him, the room filled with the sounds of men preparing for something they had all been told was historic, and which they were trying, in the particular way of soldiers, to treat as simply another duty to be executed correctly. Oakes in the next bunk over was struggling with his cross belt. He was 20 years old and had been in the regiment 8 months, and his hands were unreliable when he was nervous, which was often. Hadley watched him for a moment, then stepped over without comment and straightened the fitting in 4 efficient movements and stepped back. Oakes nodded once, face red, grateful and embarrassed in equal measure. Inspection came and Briggs was rigorous to the point of rigidity, moving down the line with his pace stick and finding corrections that were increasingly marginal. A glove sitting 2 millimeters off center. A bearskin at an angle that Hadley privately measured as well within tolerance. He said nothing. When Briggs paused in front of him and looked him over for a long 5 seconds before moving on without comment, Hadley took it as confirmation. This was a man looking for control in small things, because large things were currently beyond him. Hadley filed the observation away, made no decision from it yet. There was nothing to decide yet. At 4:50, Briggs called the section together for final orders. His voice was steady. His hands, Hadley noticed, were not quite. He held his pace stick with both of them, which was unusual, and he kept his briefing clipped and short, which was not. Normally, Briggs spoke at length before an operation, working through contingencies and standards and expectations with the methodical thoroughness of a man who believed in preparation above all things. This morning, he said what needed to be said in 90 seconds, dismissed the section, and turned away before the last man had lowered his salute. Hadley watched him turn, watched his shoulders drop by precisely the amount a man's shoulders drop when the performance becomes briefly too expensive to maintain. Then Briggs squared them again and walked toward the far end of the room, and Hadley looked away, because some things a man needs to do without being watched. They moved out at 5:15 into a London that had technically not yet become morning. The sky above the barracks was the deep purple gray of the hour before dawn, and the rain, which had briefly eased around 3, had gathered itself and returned with renewed commitment. It was not the dramatic rain of a thunderstorm. It was the English kind. Steady, cold, penetrating, deeply personal in the way it found the gap at your collar and the seam at your wrist, and the slight angle at which your bearskin sat that allowed a thin, dedicated stream to work its way toward your left ear. Hadley felt it immediately and said nothing. There was nothing useful to say about rain. It was going to rain whether you acknowledged it or not, and a guardsman who acknowledged rain in any visible way was a guardsman who had fundamentally misunderstood the job. They marched through streets that were already extraordinary. Every pavement was occupied. People pressed against the barriers that had gone up along the route, wrapped in everything they owned, holding thermoses and flags and children and each other, their faces turned toward the approaching column of red tunics and black bearskins with expressions that ran the range from quiet reverence to outright wonder. Some of them applauded. Some of them cheered. A woman near the junction of Birdcage Walk pressed both hands over her mouth and simply stared as they passed, her eyes filling. Hadley marched through it with his eyes forward and his chin level and his step exactly measured, and he felt, not for the first time and with no embarrassment about it, the particular weight of what it meant to wear this uniform on this day in this city. Not pride exactly, something older than pride, more like responsibility made physical. The understanding that the people lining these streets were not watching the men inside the tunics. They were watching the institution the tunics represented. The men were simply required to be good enough that the institution could speak through them, without interference. They reached the mall as the sky was beginning to lighten along the eastern edge, the darkness thinning from purple to gray to the grudging silver of a heavily overcast English morning. The famous avenue stretched ahead of them toward Buckingham Palace, already lined 6 and 7 deep with people who had held their ground through the night. Flags drooped in the wet. Someone had strung a homemade banner between two lampposts that read, in large, unsteady letters, "God Save the Queen," the ink running slightly in the damp. Hadley was guided to his position by a military liaison with a clipboard and the focused expression of a man managing an extraordinarily complex logistics problem. Second row, fourth man, eastern side. He took it, planted his feet, adjusted his bearskin against the rain that was now making a dedicated effort to pool along his brow. Looked straight ahead at the back of the head of the man in front of him, a corporal named Davies who was 2 inches shorter and had been in the regiment 4 years longer, and stood with the absolute stillness of someone who had achieved a complete private peace with whatever the weather intended to do to him. Hadley found his own stillness, settled into it. The city roared quietly around him, a constant wash of voices and distant music and the mechanical sounds of the largest ceremonial operation in modern British history, assembling itself around their fixed and silent line. He felt the rain work its way to his left ear and ignored it with the practiced indifference of a man who has decided that ignoring something is simply one of the available options. It was 6:23 in the morning. The coronation procession would not pass for nearly 5 hours. Time on ceremonial duty does not pass the way time passes in ordinary life. In ordinary life, time is elastic. It stretches during boredom and compresses during intensity. On the line, Hadley had learned over 18 months, time becomes something different entirely. It flattens. Becomes a single long present tense with no particular beginning or end. Just the continuous requirement to hold the position, maintain the standard, and give no outward sign of experiencing the passage of it. The crowd around them grew thicker and louder as the morning moved. By 8 o'clock, the density of people on the far side of the barriers was extraordinary, a solid mass of faces and flags and umbrellas that extended back as far as Hadley could see without moving his eyes from their forward position. The mood of the crowd was remarkable. These were people who had slept on wet stone in the rain and were now standing in more rain after a night of no meaningful shelter, and they were happy, not resigned. Not making the best of it. Genuinely, visibly, almost bewilderingly happy. Children sat on father's shoulders. Old men in their best suits stood with their hands folded, and expressions of careful dignity that suggested this moment had been important to them for reasons they probably couldn't fully articulate but felt with complete certainty. Hadley heard them singing at one point. Not organized singing. The spontaneous kind, a few voices starting and others joining without coordination, working through something that was recognizable as a patriotic song without him being able to identify it precisely, because he was currently focused on keeping his breathing even and his feet exactly where they were supposed to be. The singing lasted perhaps 3 minutes and stopped, and the crowd murmured and settled, and someone nearby laughed at something, and someone else shushed them, and the rain came in a new wave that had clearly been saving itself for maximum effect. It hit Hadley along the full left side of his face, cold, decisive, and thorough. He did not move. He was aware of the discipline required in a way that was almost pleasant, the way a difficult equation can be pleasant when you are good at mathematics. His feet had been still for over 2 hours. He was aware of them in the way you become aware of things you are successfully ignoring, a background signal that confirmed the discipline was holding. His back was straight. His chin was level. His eyes were fixed at the middle distance point that ceremonial training specified, and that also, conveniently, allowed him to be aware of his immediate surroundings without appearing to look at anything in particular. He was aware of Briggs, 3 positions to his left and slightly behind, where the sergeant stood at the end of the line with his pace stick and his gray face and his performance of total control. Hadley checked him every 12 minutes or so with the peripheral awareness he developed for exactly this kind of situation. Not starring, just nodding. The way you note a crack in a load-bearing wall, not with alarm, but with the quiet attention of someone who understands what it might eventually mean. At 9:40, The rain produced what Hadley would later describe, in the private ledger he kept for such things, as its finest work of the morning. A sustained diagonal downpour that arrived without warning and lasted 11 minutes and left the entire left side of his tunic darker than the right. Oakes, 3 places to his right, made a sound that was not quite a word. Hadley did not make any sound at all. He stood in it the way a lamppost stands in it. The crowd cheered this, inexplicably. Perhaps they found solidarity in it. Perhaps misery shared at sufficient scale tips over into something else. Whatever the reason, the 11-minute downpour was followed by a sustained wave of singing and flag waving from the crowd that seemed almost celebratory, as if the rain had been the final test and they had collectively decided they had passed it. Then a different sound moved through the crowd. Not a cheer, something quieter and more complicated. The kind of sound a very large number of people make when something they have been waiting for has begun. It was 10:47. Hadley knew the time because he had a precise internal clock, and because the briefing had specified that the advance units of the procession would begin moving through outer positions at approximately 11:15, which meant the next 28 minutes were the final margin before everything became irreversible and exact. He heard it rather than saw it, a shift in the quality of the air behind him. The particular sound, almost no sound at all, of a large man sitting down without intending to. He did not turn immediately. He gave it 2 seconds, counting them with the same internal precision he applied to everything, allowing for the possibility that he had misread it. Then he heard Oakes, who was closer to the back of the line, draw a breath that was not a normal breath, and Hadley turned with the minimal movement of a man who has decided that the situation has changed and that pretending otherwise is no longer useful. Briggs was on one knee, not collapsed entirely. One knee on the wet road, one hand braced against his thigh, head down, shoulders working with the effort of a man fighting his own body for the right to remain upright. His pace stick was on the ground beside him. His face, in the brief moment before he raised it, was the color of old chalk. The line had not broken. The men were still standing, but several of them had fractionally turned, the slight shift of a head or a shoulder that meant they had seen it and were waiting for someone to tell them what it meant. Hadley counted to 3. No one spoke. No officer materialized from the crowd. No senior NCO appeared from the direction of the palace. The 28 minutes were counting down, and the line was beginning to develop the particular fragility of a structure whose keystone has moved. He made his decision. He stepped out of his position with the measured authority of a man who has decided that what he is doing is correct, and who is therefore doing it without hesitation or apology, and he walked to Briggs in 4 steps. He crouched beside him, close enough to be heard at a murmur, and said 2 words, "Sergeant, down." Briggs looked up at him. His eyes were focused, but the effort it cost him to focus them was visible. He said nothing. Hadley said, "I have the section. You need to move back to the barrier and sit down before the procession line gets eyes on this position." It was not a request. It was not, technically, something a corporal said to a sergeant. It was also the only correct option available in the next 30 seconds, and Briggs, who was a good soldier even when he was a sick one, understood that. He nodded once, a small, exhausted movement, and Hadley helped him to his feet with one hand under his arm and walked him the 4 steps to the crowd barrier, and handed him to a civilian police constable stationed there with the quiet instruction to get him water and keep him upright and call for medical support through the proper channel. The constable, to his credit, asked no questions and did exactly that. Hadley picked up Briggs's pace stick from the wet road. He turned back to the line. 24 minutes. He did not announce what had happened. He did not explain himself to the section. He simply moved back into position and then, with the unhurried movement of a man on a pre-planned inspection, began walking the line from the inside, staying close, staying quiet, keeping his voice below the threshold of the crowd noise that surrounded them. The section had 11 men remaining. He knew all of them. knew their tendencies, their weak points, the specific ways each of them expressed the stress they were trying not to show. Davies at the front was solid, always solid, would stand in a hurricane without comment. Oakes, 3 from the right, had a problem with his left knee that caused him to shift his weight every 40 minutes or so, a small movement that was technically a deviation and that Hadley had been watching for. Private Martin, who was standing with admirable rigidity but whose bearskin had developed a slight forward tilt that would be visible from the procession route. He addressed these things one by one, murmured to Oakes without breaking his own stride that his weight was moving and to correct it now. Stopped behind Martin for precisely 2 seconds and adjusted the bearskin with a single precise push that brought it to the correct angle. Caught the eye of a guardsman named Fletcher at the far end, who was showing the particular stillness of someone who has stopped thinking and started performing, which was subtly different and subtly wrong, and held his gaze for a moment and gave a single small nod that said, "I see you, you're fine, hold it."